Watching television is a trance-like experience. You forget about the carpet, the curtains, and that you're sitting in a room, and you engage your experience directly into the television screen, so that whatever happens on the screen seems really real. You suspend belief in reality. If you don't take responsibility for what goes into your mind, somebody else will. Cult leaders, politicians, advertisers will all seek to implant their message in your mind, whether it's for your good or not.
The greatest battle of the 21st century will be a battle of the mind. And there are people who have power who want more power, and they do not want the public to know about mind control, its existence, or how it's implemented.
There is a body of information being used by government to control the way people think and act, and experiments are systematically designed to increase government's knowledge about that. This is the most threatening part of being a citizen in a democracy. When your government can manipulate how you vote and how you think, you no longer live in a democracy.
You don't take responsibility for what goes into your mind, somebody else will.
The greatest battle of the 21st century will be a battle of the mind.
I think it's possible to brainwash, manipulate, coerce people to do just about anything.
Healthy religion preserves a person's sense of free will, whereas destructive mind control cults do not want people to think for themselves.
Under the right circumstances, most people can have their views manipulated and altered.
A mente humana, a ferramenta mais poderosa à face da Terra. A sua capacidade para criar ou destruir é ilimitada. A habilidade de controlar ou influenciar a mente humana é poder supremo, o poder de manipular, subjugar e dominar. É a história arrepiante da batalha pelo controle das mentes humanas, uma guerra de ideologias pelo domínio do mundo. A batalha pelo controle mental é realizada usando sexo, espiões e drogas psicadélicas.
White would watch behind two-way mirrors while these prostitutes whom he was working with would slip drugs, including LSD, into the drinks of these people who thought they were just there to have a night of pleasure.
É a história verídica e poderosa de uma conspiração da CIA envolvendo operativos a soldo, encobrimentos burocráticos e psiquiátricos sádicos.
What Cameron was doing was well beyond an experimental treatment. It was in the realm of science fiction.
O projeto conta experiências horripilantes que deixaram centenas de pessoas marcadas para a vida.
I received a total of 109 electroconvulsive shock treatments. I had 86 straight comatose days.
Esta procura incessante por armas psicológicas alastrou-se a todo o mundo, deixando um rastro de mortes misteriosas.
These people were not sentimental about human life, and they certainly believed that everything they were doing was in the interest of maintaining the freedom of the Western world.
No fim, produziu um legado de controle mental que chegaria ao novo milénio.
If you don't take responsibility for what goes into your mind, somebody else will.
The greatest battle of the 21st century will be a battle of the mind.
Armed with knives, armed with chemical, biological, nuclear weapons. Fanatics, terrorists, September 11th. September 11th, killers, September 11th, terrorists. Terrorists of Al-Qaeda, terrorists, nuclear weapons, terrorists. 9/11, terror, terrorist, evil. September 11th, September 11th. The terrorists, war and danger. September 11th, terrorism, global terrorism, terrorism, terrorists. Terrorists, 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 the terror. Terrorists, terrorists, terrorism. September 11th, global terrorism, terrorists. Terrorism. September 11th, world terrorism. Terrorism. September 11th, global terrorism. September the 11th, terror. Weapons of mass destruction. September the 11th, terrorists. The evil terror. Terrorists, no.
Remember that every single man, woman, and child in the state of South Carolina awakens to a freer, safer world because of George Bush. I would remind people that every single morning we all awaken to a safer, freer world because of George Bush. And Nicole, I would remind you and the people of Florence that all of us awaken every single day to a freer, safer world because of George Bush. They themselves awaken every single day to a freer, safer world because of George Bush.
That was University of Wisconsin professor Kevin Barrett, who has recently drawn criticism for plans to teach an Islamic studies course next fall that will incorporate conspiracy theories that the U.S. government was involved in the events of September 11th. Professor Barrett joins us now. Professor, can you give us the context within which you teach this?
Okay. What you've just seen here is he used a nonverbal gesture with his hands and an outward motion to kind of scatter his thinking, and then swayed both of his hands over to his left shoulder, which would give the subconscious impression of being far to the left, and also kind of distracts his thinking a little bit. So that's what he's doing. That's why his hands are all over the place, and then they swing over to his left shoulder to send the subconscious message that he is an extremist, a left-winger. Okay?
Can you give us the context within which you teach this?
Well, yeah, sure. I'm teaching an introductory course on Islam, and I think it's really important to cover these contemporary political issues, and one of them is, of course, the so-called war on terror. Now, the fact is that the great majority of the world's Muslims believe that 9/11 was an inside job.
But that's your opinion, right?
Again, manipulation is all about timing and redirecting and trying to take control of somebody when they're speaking. Here, you see a great example of that by saying that's your opinion, even though he just stated there's a vast number of people that are waking up, even though he specifies the Muslim community. That's not true. It's all over the world. So the journalist's responsibility to misdirect his thinking and to mislead you is to follow up and say, but that's your opinion, even though he stated that it wasn't just his opinion. But it doesn't matter, because people believe what they hear from newscasters. They take in the barrage of words, and the newscaster here understands that. So if he says that, he plants that seed.
Now, the fact is that the great majority of the world's Muslims believe that 9/11 was an inside job.
But that's your opinion, right?
Well, no, that's
your opinion that there was an inside job.
Well, after studying the evidence pretty intensively for 2.5 years, I am convinced that 9/11 was, in fact, an inside job.
And are students required to regurgitate that in some way in order to do well in your class?
Again, more manipulation. I'm sure you caught that. Even though this very system of the world creates people to regurgitate, they will often accuse people of doing the things that they do. It's just part of it, okay? So by saying our students required to regurgitate that gives the subconscious impression that he is controlling their minds and not teaching them to think, when in actuality, to be able to see through the media, to be able to see what is going on, is not regurgitation. Any person that does regurgitate and only memorize and not think would not be able to see through it anyway. It doesn't matter. This is reverse psychology. This is just not even that. It's just manipulation. It's just name-calling. It's I'm rubber, you're glue. Again, this is a way that he disrupts the guy's thinking with petty comments like that. He knows that this type of person would never want anybody to regurgitate anything, because that doesn't allow them to learn to think. Doesn't matter. If there's an audience to this, he plants that seed again.
Well, after studying the evidence pretty intensively for 2.5 years, I am convinced that 9/11 was, in fact, an inside job.
And are students required to regurgitate that in some way in order to do well in your class?
That's ridiculous. No, I'm not interested in making students regurgitate anything.
All right, Mr. Barrett, Sean Hannity here. Do you really believe that 9/11 was an inside job?
Okay, Sean Hannity. I never watched Fox News before, but within seconds of seeing this guy, you can just see that he is a snake. At least he is currently conducting himself as such. Now, this is pretty basic what he's doing. He's not giving eye contact. He's pretending to be bored with the guy's very presence. And this is a way to discredit him that way, as if he's just some sort of gnat and not even worth considering, and that's why he's purposely looking down and acting bored when he talks to him. Secondly, he uses the word believe. Do you really believe? To believe is not to know, and that's why he's stressing that. And again, you're going to start to see extreme manipulation from this Mr. Hannity.
All right, Mr. Barrett, Sean Hannity here. Do you really believe that 9/11 was an inside job, not just 9/11, but Madrid and Bali and the Zakawi operation?
Well, you know, actually...
hang on a second.
Yeah, okay.
All right, so what he does is he tries to take control of this conversation right away. He insinuates something, and the professor was smart enough to catch what he was saying, and then when he tried to respond to that, he interrupts him to take control. Now, notice, and I'll point this out in a little bit, when he puts his hand up in the OK sign, you're about to learn what that really means and what they use it for. But for now, just understand that that's how they'll do it. They'll insult you while they speak and try to continue speaking before you can actually reply to it. And therefore, it makes the professor look nuts. You know what I mean? Because if people don't catch this neuro-linguistic programming, if they don't catch the manipulation, you know, which is comprises the majority of the audience anyway, nevertheless, if they don't catch it, then he can do that. He can take those cheap shots, and when the professor tries to correct those, then he interrupts him, says, hey, hold on, you know, and then tries to make him look rude for interrupting and take control over him and disrupt his thinking at the same time.
Well, you know, actually... hang on a second. Do you believe personally that these are inside jobs, yes or no?
It's not quite that simple.
Okay, believe personally, that's another way to plant that into your psyche, that it is just he that believes this. And then he uses the yes or no trap, because that is, again, misleading if you can't see that. The way he twisted around that question would not allow the professor to be able to give a yes or no answer, because he injected manipulation into the question itself. So when the professor tries to say that, of course, then it puts him under pressure. The professor is smart enough to catch that, and it isn't that simple, and he understands. The professor knew, of course, what I'm telling you right now. However, time is ticking. He only has so much time on the air, and their job is to disrupt his thinking as much as possible and make as many hidden accusations as they can and as many subconscious embeds into how to perceive the professor as they can in the short amount of time that he's on the air, and that's their only job, is to discredit and disrupt. Okay? But he did catch it. Now he has to respond to that rather than being able to say anything that matters. And that's what they do. Another good person at this is Stephen Colbert. If you watch Stephen Colbert with any of his interviews, his whole job is to discredit and disrupt. That's what he does, and you keep it moving. It's very, very petty, but these are the people that you allow to run you, okay? So know that, and that's what's going on right here.
Yes or no?
It's not quite that simple. I do know, I don't believe, I know that 9/11 was an inside job. Professor Stephen Jones has found residue of thermate on the steel samples from the World Trade Center. We now know that it was taken down in a controlled demolition.
All right, so you believe that the buildings came down in a controlled demolition?
Okay, so the professor did a really good job of identifying his manipulation by saying, I don't believe, I know. And because he was starting to get through that, Hannity interrupts him and says, I don't have a lot of time. Well, wait a minute, you just asked him a question, and now he's able to break through your manipulation, and suddenly you don't have a lot of time for the very answer to the question that you just asked. The next thing you see, he asks him, what evidence does he have? And he interrupted him giving the evidence to ask him what evidence he has. Why? Of course, he's not interested in hearing the evidence or anybody else hearing it. He's interested in interrupting him and planting another embed into the psyche that what he happens to be saying right now is somehow not evidence. It's all misdirection of focus, redirection of focus, disrupting, interrupting, gaining control, and, you know, it's this very petty, they rely on these petty techniques. Now, at the end of this, he does something that a lot of you probably aren't aware of. He does a hand gesture. He takes both of his hands and puts them up in front of his head and then pulls them down. And he pretends he's talking about the buildings falling down. What that is I don't know what they would term it. I'm just intuitive. I'm perceptive. I can see what they're doing. That's sorcery. Sorcery is just anything that is used to circumvent the conscious mind, to control the mind. That gesture is designed to take away his zest, his focus, his power. By bringing his hands down like that, he's trying to subconsciously take away the focus of the professor, take away his power. And that's exactly what he's doing, and that's what you're seeing, and I'll play that again for you.
Job. Professor Stephen Jones has found residue of thermate on the steel samples from the World Trade Center. We now know that it was taken down in a controlled demolition. All
right, so you believe that the buildings came down in a controlled demolition, right?
Well, I don't believe it. I've looked at the evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming.
All right, the evidence is overwhelming to you because you're a conspiracy nut, but
no, actually, all of you, I ask your viewers to take...
Okay. Now, in this one, I'm sure you caught the obvious part, but you probably did not catch the neuro-linguistic programming. What exactly is neuro-linguistic programming? Simply put, it's dual meaning that is speaking to the subconscious. Now, of course, he's shaping public opinion by saying, it's obvious to you because you are a conspiracy nut. Well, remember now, people are very phobic of being called anything that goes against the norm. So if you agree with him, oh, then you're a nut, and people, you know, they can't escape their own ego. So that's used to shape him. What you probably didn't catch is him saying, but, you know, putting that all aside, this is neuro-linguistic programming. Now, pay attention here. You're a conspiracy nut, but putting that all aside, what that is doing is he's directing your subconscious mind and your conscious mind to store that label, that impression of him. Put it aside. Keep that. It's called anchoring. In neuro-linguistic programming, because I've watched a little bit of it. I didn't need to watch it to pick up on how they do this, but it allows you to get some of their terminology down. They call this anchoring. Anchoring a thought, anchoring a concept, anchoring a feeling. Putting all of that aside means put that aside in your mind. He's a conspiracy nut. Do you see how they manipulate you? That's a very good lesson right there in neuro-linguistic programming.
All right, the evidence is overwhelming to you because you're a conspiracy nut, but
no,
you know,
actually, all of you, I ask your viewers to take a look at this evidence for themselves. They can go to st911.org. That's Scholars for 9/11 Truth. Take a look. Take a look at the demolitions.
I know you
Morgan Reynolds, the former Bush administration official.
Okay, that's pretty obvious. You see how he's treating him. Very nonchalant, irritated, bored. And I know you think you're the smartest guy in the world. This is, you know, the typical you're a know-it-all type of comment. If you watch that David Icke video where he goes back on Wogan, he draws attention to the same thing where he said, whoa, that's a cheap shot, when he said, you know it all. And the response was accurate. I'm not saying I know it all. But people are trained to hate people who, quote, know it all. Why? Because they want you to be dumb. That's why in society you have catchphrases that go around that people use, like, you think too much, you're too deep, you know it all. These have all become derogatory terms in this new Orwellian society. Haven't you noticed that? His response is petty and childish, but he means to be this way. It does nothing, it addresses nothing. He can't think of anything to say in response to the professor, so he has to take a cheap shot like this. I know you think you're the smartest guy in the world. That should be obvious to you, that is just overdoing it, creating, manifesting an insult, just, again, for one reason and one reason only, to disrupt his thinking and to program your mind on how to view him.
Take a look at the demolitions. I know you Morgan Reynolds, the former Bush administration official, says that the Bush administration blew the World Trade Center to kingdom come. That's a direct quote from a member of the Bush administration itself.
I know.
They blew
and there
the
were
World
people
Trade
that
Center
said
to
that the
kingdom
Jews were told to leave. Well, we've heard a lot of these sick, bizarre theories.
Okay, so suddenly he's an anti-Semite? When did that come about? I didn't hear him say anything about the Jews. What he's doing here is he's trying to link him to anti-Semitism. That's what they want to do. Now, anybody that's really trying to speak the truth in this world has no interest in focusing on a group or even an individual. What they try to focus on is the problem in general, outside of any group or individual that may be manifesting the symptoms of the problem. But again, what he's trying to do here is, in your mind, link the professor to being part of a hate group, someone that's going to target a group or an individual, and make you link the terms sick and bizarre to the professor. He didn't say anything about the Jewish community. Nothing. So catch that. See how he's trying to link the professor to it.
The World Trade Center to Kingdom Come. That's a direct quote from a member of the Bush administration itself.
I know.
They
and
flew
there
the
were
World
people
Trade
that
Center
said
to
that the
Kingdom
Jews
Come.
were told to leave. Well, we've heard a lot of these sick, bizarre theories.
That's
and I
not
don't
the
believe
same
any
thing.
of them, but you're allowed to believe what you want, but that's not what's at hand here.
Okay, now another thing, just to make you aware, again, of just how much they're programming your mind. To you, it looks like a man that said that's not the issue at hand here. You need to start learning their language. Their language is dual meaning, which goes hand in hand with neuro-linguistic programming. The issue at hand here, what he's doing is directing the professor to look at his hand. Now, why would he have the professor look at his hand? Well, if you look at his hand right now, you see it as what you've been told is the OK sign, right? Well, let's show you what it really means. The OK symbol, as you see right here, means 666. For some reason, 666 has some sort of control over the mind. Now, it could have something to do with the beast computers many of you have read about. It's sorcery. It is putting a hex on somebody. It is subconscious symbolism that somehow affects some people. It doesn't affect everybody. But he's using that, and he was directing the professor to look at his hand to use sorcery on him. It's not that one thing will work. They try to use as many combinations of things as they can. But that is a symbol, and it means 666, and that is why he told him to look at his hand, or the issue at hand here told his mind subconsciously to look at his hand. Do you see? And that is what just occurred there. That's not what's at hand here, meaning you are not allowed to believe what you want. And that also tells the population looking at him, because remember, he is also talking to people that are watching television. And so they are also instructed to look at his hand subconsciously or take notice of it subconsciously. And when he says you're allowed to believe what you want, but that's not what's at hand here, he's saying with the 666 rule over your mind, you are not allowed to believe what you want. And that speaks to your subconscious mind and programs people to not think. And that's what it means all around and all together. That's what just happened.
Of them, but you're allowed to believe what you want, but that's not what's at hand here. The issue is whether or not you, with your bizarre theories, are the best.
I think you have the bizarre theory. You think it was 19 bucks?
Okay, again, saying his issues, his views are bizarre, right? But the reason he puts up his pinky there is because that is the weakest finger, that it would imply a small penis, not a potent man, using that in reference to him, saying that he is impotent, that he is bizarre, that he is weak, and that he is of the pinky. And that's why he chooses, of all fingers and all gestures, to speak about his theories, he puts his pinky up. And these are all subconscious sorcery methods. Again, sorcery is not some guy wearing a magician's hat. Part of sorcery is speaking to and manipulating the conscious mind from the subconscious.
It's whether or not you, with your bizarre theories, are the best.
I think you have the bizarre theory. You think it was 19 bucks? Guys with box cutters led by a guy on dialysis in a cave in Afghanistan? That's ridiculous. Yeah. I mean, that's the craziest conspiracy theory of all of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I wish I had the Twilight Zone music. Now, here's my next...
See, all he can say is something to discredit him. I wish I had the Twilight Zone music. And then the people watching the televisions that say, yes, that must be weird. Twilight Zone music is weird. And the honest and credible news reporter is saying that about him. Okay? Now, you see that all the neuro-linguistic programming is starting to get to the professor. He's starting to screw up his words. He's starting to screw up his concentration. He's mispronouncing. That's because there's a lot of negative energy being focused on him, interrupting his thought process. So you can see how he's starting to screw up his words, but he's still holding, with all of that working against him and being unaware of those techniques, he still holds his own, but you start to see it get to him a little bit.
I mean, that's the craziest conspiracy theory of all of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I wish I had the Twilight Zone music. Now, here's my next question. The issue that is at hand here, you're entitled to have your opinion. I don't really care what you believe.
As the drums of war begin to beat once again in Iran, Syria, the South China Sea, and other potential hotspots and flashpoints around the globe, concerned citizens are asking how a world so sick of bloodshed and a population so tired of conflict could be led to this spot once again. To understand this seeming paradox, we must first understand the centuries-long history of how media has been used to whip the nation into wartime frenzy, dehumanize the supposed enemies, and even to manipulate the public into believing in causes for war that, decades later, were admitted to be completely fictitious. The term yellow journalism was coined to describe the type of sensationalistic, scandal-driven, and often erroneous style of reporting popularized by newspapers like William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. In one of the most egregious examples of this phenomenon, Hearst's papers widely trumpeted the sinking of the USS Maine as the work of the Spanish. Whipped into an anti-Spanish frenzy by a daily torrent of stories depicting Spanish forces' alleged torture and rape of Cubans, and pushed over the edge by the Maine incident, the public welcomed the beginning of the U.S.-Spanish War. Although it is now widely believed that the explosion on the Maine was due to a fire in one of its coal bunkers, the initial lurid reports of Spanish involvement stuck, and the nation was led into war. In many ways, the phrase infamously attributed to Hearst in reply to his illustrator, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war," apocryphal as the story may be, nevertheless perfectly encodes the method by which the public would be led to war time and again through the decades. The U.S. was drawn into World War I by the sinking of the Lusitania, a British ocean liner carrying American passengers that was torpedoed by German U-boats off the coast of Ireland, killing over 1,000 of its passengers. What the public was not informed about at the time, of course, was that just 1 week before the incident, then First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill had written to the President of the Board of Trade that it was most important to attract neutral shipping to our shores, in the hopes especially of embroiling the United States with Germany. Nor did reports of the attack announce that the ship was carrying rifle ammunition and other military supplies. Instead, reports once again emphasized that the attack was an out-of-the-blue strike by a maniacal enemy, and the public was led into war. The U.S. involvement in World War II was likewise the result of deliberate disinformation. Although the Honolulu Advertiser had even predicted the attack on Pearl Harbor days in advance, the Japanese naval codes had already been deciphered by that time, and that even Henry Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, had noted in his diary the week before that he had discussed in a meeting with Roosevelt how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. The public were still led to believe that the Pearl Harbor attack had been completely unforeseen. Just last month, a newly declassified memo emerged showing that FDR had been warned of an impending Japanese attack on Hawaii just 3 days before the events at Pearl Harbor. Yet the history books still portray Pearl Harbor as an example of a surprise attack. In August 1964, the public was told that the North Vietnamese had attacked a U.S. destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin on 2 separate occasions. The attacks were portrayed as a clear example of communist aggression, and a resolution was soon passed in Congress authorizing President Johnson to begin deploying U.S. forces in Vietnam. In 2005, an internal NSA study was released concluding that the second attack, in fact, never took place. In effect, 60,000 American servicemen and as many as 3 million Vietnamese, let alone as many as 500,000 Cambodians and Laotians, lost their lives because of an incident that did not occur anywhere but in the imagination of the Johnson administration and the pages of the American media. In 1991, the world was introduced to the emotional story of Naria, a Kuwaiti girl who testified about the atrocities committed by Iraqi forces in Kuwait.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying.
What the world was never told was that the incident had in fact been the work of a public relations firm, Hill & Knowlton, and the girl had actually been the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. The public was whipped into a frenzy of hatred for the Hussein regime, not for the documented atrocities that it had actually committed on segments of its own population, with weapons supplied to them by the United States itself, but on the basis of an imaginary story told to the public via their televisions, orchestrated by a PR firm. In the lead-up to the war on Iraq, the American media infamously took the lead in framing the debate about the Iraqi government's weapons of mass destruction not as a question of whether or not they even existed, but as a question of where they had been hidden and what should be done to disarm them. The New York Times led the way with Judith Miller's now infamous reporting on the Iraqi WMD story, now known to have been based on false information from untrustworthy sources. But the rest of the media fell into line, with the NBC Nightly News asking what precise threat Iraq and its weapons of mass destruction posed to America, and Time debating whether Hussein was making a good faith effort to disarm Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Reports about chemical weapons stashes were reported on before they were confirmed, although headlines boldly asserted their existence as indisputable fact. We now know that the stockpiles did not exist, and the administration premeditatedly lied the country into yet another war. But the most intense opposition the Bush administration ever received over this documented war crime was some polite correction on the Sunday political talk show circuit.
Well, let me just ask you this. If they did not have these weapons of mass destruction, though, granted, all of that is true, why then did they pose an immediate threat to us, to this country?
You and a few other critics are the only people I've heard use the phrase immediate threat. I didn't. The president didn't. And it's become kind of folklore that that's what's happened. The president went...
You're saying that nobody in the administration said that?
I can't speak for nobody and everybody in the administration and say nobody said that.
Vice President didn't say that?
Not, if you have any citations, I'd like to see them.
We have one here that says, some have argued that this is you speaking, some have argued that the nuclear threat from Iraq is not imminent, that Saddam is at least 5 to 7 years away from having nuclear weapons. I would not be so certain.
And
close to imminent.
Well, I've tried to be precise and I've tried to be accurate.
No terrorist state poses a greater or more immediate threat to the security of our people and the stability of the world than the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
My view of the situation was that he had, we believe, the best intelligence that we had and other countries had.
Remarkably, the public at large has seemingly learned nothing at all from all of these documented historical manipulations. If anything, the media has become even bolder in its attempts to manipulate the public's perceptions, perhaps emboldened by the fact that so few in the audience seem willing to question the picture that is being painted for them on the evening news. In 2008, CNN aired footage of a bombed-out Skin Valley in South Ossetia, falsely labeling it as footage of Gori, which they said had been attacked by the Russians. This was immediately refuted by the cameraman who had actually taken the footage.
Today, when we arrived and news came that Gori was being shelled, I saw my footage. I said, that's not Gori, that's Tsin Valley. Having crawled through the length and the breadth of Tsin Valley, I don't need much to tell from which point this or that footage was recorded. I can swear in front of any tribunal. I can point to this location on the map of the town because I and the cameraman of the Rossiya channel videotaped that. It is 50 meters away from the entrance to the territory of the peacekeepers. Those guys who every move is regulated by the UN were all killed. The Georgians shot up their entire battalion.
In 2009, the BBC showed a cropped image of a rally in Iran, which they claimed was a crowd of protesters who assembled to show their opposition to the Iranian government. An uncropped version of the same photograph displayed on the LA Times website, however, revealed that the photo in fact came from a rally in support of Ahmadinejad. In August of 2011, the BBC ran footage of what they claimed was a celebration in Tripoli's Green Square. When sharp-eyed viewers noticed that the flags in the footage were in fact Indian flags, the BBC was forced to admit that they had accidentally broadcast footage from India instead of Tripoli. Also that month, CNN reported on a story from the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, claiming that 8 infants in incubators had died in a hospital in Hama, where Syrian authorities cut off power in the area. Some news sites even carried pictures of the infants. The images were later admitted to have been taken in Egypt, and no evidence has ever emerged to back up the accusations. As breathtaking as all of these lies, manipulations, and so-called mistakes are, they in and of themselves don't represent the only functions of the media for the war machine. Now, the US government is taking the lead in becoming more and more directly involved with the shaping of the media message on war propaganda, and the general public is becoming even more ensnared in a false picture of the world, painted with the Pentagon's own paintbrush. In 2005, the Bush White House admitted to producing videos that were designed to look like news reports from legitimate independent journalists, and then feeding those reports to media outlets as prepackaged material ready to air on the evening news. When the Government Accountability Office ruled that these fake news reports in fact constituted illegal covert propaganda, the White House simply issued a memo declaring the practice to be legal. In April 2008, the New York Times revealed a secret U.S. Department of Defense program that was launched in 2002 and involved using retired military officers to implant Pentagon talking points in the media. The officers were presented as independent analysts on talk shows and news programs, although they had been specially briefed before their appearances by the Pentagon. In December of 2011, the DoD's own Inspector General released a report concluding that the program was in perfect compliance with government policies and regulations. Earlier this year, it was revealed that the U.S. government had contracted with H.B. Gary Federal to develop software that created fake social media accounts in order to steer public opinion and promote propaganda on popular websites. The federal contract for the software sourced back to the MacDill Air Force Base in Florida. As the vehicle through which information from the outside world is captured, sorted, edited, and transmitted into our homes, the mass media has the huge responsibility of shaping and informing our understanding of events to which we don't have first-hand access. This is an awesome responsibility in even the most ideal conditions, with diligent reporters guided by trustworthy editors doing their level best to report the most important news in the most straightforward way. But in a media landscape where a handful of companies own virtually all of the print, radio, and television media in each nation, the only recourse the public has is to turn away from the mainstream media altogether. And that is precisely what is happening. As study after study and report after report has shown, the death of the old media has accelerated in recent years, with more and more people abandoning newspapers and now even television as their main source of news. Instead, the public is increasingly turning toward online sources for their news and information, something that is necessarily worrying for the war machine itself, a system that can only truly flourish when the propaganda arm is held under monopolistic control. But as citizens turn away from the New York Times and toward independent websites, many run and maintained by citizen journalists and amateur editors, the system that has consolidated its control over the mind of the public for generations seems to finally be showing signs that it may not be invincible. Surely this is not to say that online media is impervious to the defects that have made the traditional media so unreliable, quite the contrary. But the difference is that online, there is still for the time being relative freedom of choice at the individual level. While internet freedom exists, individual readers and viewers don't have to take the word of any website or pundit on any issue. They can check the source documentation themselves, except, perhaps not coincidentally, on the websites of the traditional media bastions, which tend not to link source material and documentation in their articles. Hence the SOPA Act, Protect IP, the US government's attempts to seize websites at the domain name level, and all the other concerted attacks we have seen on internet freedoms in recent years. Because ultimately, an informed and engaged public is far less likely to go along with wars waged for power and profit. And as the public becomes better informed about the very issues that the media has tried to lie to them about for so long, they realize that the answer to all of the mainstream media's war cheerleading and blatant manipulation is perhaps simpler than we ever suspected. All we have to do is turn them off.
O que faz falta é animar a malta, o que faz falta. O que faz falta é acordar a malta, o que faz falta.